In the autumn of 1888, in the Hardscrabble, Montana Territory, the settlers of the Coulter Valley saw a man engaged in what looked like madness. His name was Elias Thorne, a quiet Welshman with dust in the lines of his face, and a silence about him that the garrulous frontiersman found unsettling. While other men were felling the last of the season's timber and chinking their cabins against the coming winter, Thorne was hauling perfectly good lumber up the steep northern slope of the valley. He was hauling it into the dark, yawning mouth of the old Black Mare silver mine, abandoned a decade prior. He wasn't clearing the mine. He was building in it. From the valley floor, they could watch his silhouette against the sky, a lonely figure wrestling beams and planks into the earth's gullet. He worked from dawn until the last light failed, a methodical, relentless pace that had no audience but the circling hawks and the whispering pines. The work was slow, arduous, and to every practical mind in Coulter Valley, utterly insane. "He's digging his own tomb," muttered a trapper at the trading post, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near the stove. The sentiment rippled through the small community, hardening into accepted fact. The project earned a name, as such follies often do. They called it Thorne's Tomb, a grim joke whispered over fence posts and mugs of weak coffee. His wife Annalise and their two small children, a boy and a girl, were seen helping him, their small forms carrying what they could. This transformed the community's judgment from mockery to a dark, pitying concern. The man was not only a fool, he was a fool, endangering his family. What did this quiet outsider, this miner from a distant land, understand about survival that every seasoned pioneer and builder in the valley had supposedly missed? What secret did he believe was buried in that cold, dead rock? The answer would be delivered by the cruelest winter in living memory, a trial of ice and wind that would test every assumption and break every tradition. Before you see how this story ends, and I promise you the conclusion is worth the wait, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, then drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's understand the problem Elias Thorne was trying to solve. Winter in the Montana Territory was not a season. It was a predator. It stalked the valleys from late October and did not release its grip until April. The cold was a physical presence, a thing with weight and malice. It was a dry, searing cold that cracked timber and split skin. It was driven by a wind that the settlers called the barber, for how it seemed to shave the warmth from a man's very bones. Survival was measured in two things: the height of your woodpile and the quality of your cabin. The conventional wisdom, brought west from the forests of Ohio and Pennsylvania, was clear. A proper cabin was built from thick, interlocking logs, the gaps stuffed tight with a mixture of mud, moss, and horsehair. It had a massive stone fireplace at one end, a roaring hearth that was the symbolic and literal heart of the home. A well-built cabin, it was said, could withstand anything the land could throw at it. This was a lie. A comforting, traditional, and deadly lie. Elias Thorne knew it was a lie because he had spent the previous winter, his first in the valley, renting a small, expertly built cabin from the community's most respected builder, Silas Blackwood. He had watched the truth of the cold with the dispassionate eye of an engineer. He saw how the great stone fireplace, for all its cheerful blaze, was a deeply inefficient machine. It consumed cords of wood at a terrifying rate, but most of the heat went straight up the chimney, pulling the precious warm air from the cabin with it. He had observed the physics of failure. He saw how frost formed on the heads of the nails driven into the interior walls, perfect white stars marking the pathways where the cold was infiltrating his home. He watched his wife Annalise stuff rags into the gaps around the window frames, a futile battle against the relentless siege of the wind. He felt the drafts that snaked across the floor, chilling the feet and stealing the body's heat. The family lived their lives in a small semicircle around the fire, a tiny island of warmth in an ocean of bitter cold. To move more than 10 feet from the hearth was to enter another climate zone. His background gave him a different lens through which to see the problem. Elias Thorne had not grown up a woodsman. He had grown up underground. In the coal pits of the Rhondda Valley in Wales, he had learned a different set of truths. He learned that just a few dozen feet below the frost-covered ground, the earth maintained a steady, constant temperature. It was a cool temperature, to be sure, around 50 or 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but it was constant. It did not matter if the sun baked the surface in summer or if a blizzard raged in winter. The deep earth was stable. It was a massive planetary reservoir of thermal energy. He had also learned about air. He understood how it moved, how it carried heat, and how it could be managed. In the mines, controlling the flow of air was the difference between life and a suffocating, gas-filled death. To a frontiersman, a hole in the ground was a place to be avoided. To Elias Thorne, it was a tool. The settlers of Coulter Valley built their homes to fight the winter, to erect a barrier of wood and stone against the cold. Elias Thorne understood you could not win a direct fight against a force that powerful. You had to use its own nature and the nature of the earth itself to sidestep the battle entirely. He wasn't building a fortress against the cold. He was building a home inside an insulator that nature had already provided, the mountain itself. His work began not with an axe, but with a surveyor's line and a plumb bob. He chose the Black Mare mine for specific reasons. Its entrance faced south, granting it maximum exposure to the low winter sun. The main chamber was a stable dome of granite, roughly 40 feet deep and 30 feet wide, with a dry, packed floor. Crucially, he had found a narrow fissure, a natural chimney in the rock that snaked its way to the surface some 60 feet higher up the hillside. Inside this rock chamber, he began to construct a cabin. It was a simple, timber-frame structure, but its placement was everything. He did not build it against the rock walls. Instead, he left a deliberate, continuous gap of 3 feet on all sides and above the roof. This open space, this air jacket, as he thought of it, was the most critical part of the design. The cabin stood inside the mine like a ship in a bottle. His neighbors saw him hauling lumber into a cave and assumed he was lining the walls. The reality was far more sophisticated. He was creating a separate, sealed micro-environment, buffered from the mountain's chill by a thick blanket of trapped air. Then came the heart of the system, the stove. It was a small, efficient cast-iron box stove, not a cavernous fireplace. But its installation was what drew the first direct confrontation with the valley's established expert. Silas Blackwood was a bull of a man, with hands like gnarled oak burls and a reputation for honesty and craftsmanship. He had built nearly every structure in the valley that was still standing. He felt a sense of duty to the community, and he saw Thorne's project not just as foolish, but as a danger. One crisp October afternoon, Blackwood climbed the slope to the mine. He found Thorne fitting sections of metal stovepipe. The pipe did not go straight from the stove up through the cabin roof. Instead, it exited the back wall of the cabin and then began a long, serpentine journey through the 3-foot air gap. It ran horizontally for nearly 20 feet, then climbed at a gentle angle along the rock ceiling, before finally connecting to the natural fissure that led to the open air. Blackwood watched for a long time, his face a mask of disbelief. Finally, he spoke, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Thorne, what in God's name are you doing?" Elias turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Putting in the stove, Mr. Blackwood." "That's not a chimney, that's a death trap," Blackwood stated, his voice devoid of malice, presenting it as simple fact. "You're running it near 100 feet, most of it sideways. The smoke will cool before it ever leaves. Creosote will build up in those horizontal runs like black tar. First, deep cold snap, you'll light a hot fire, and that pipe will turn into a cannon. It'll burn you and your family alive in this hole. It was a sound, logical objection, based on decades of experience. A chimney needed a strong, hot, vertical draft to function safely. Thorne's design defied that principle. Elias nodded, considering the words. It will draw. The fissure is high. The draft will be steady. Blackwood's gaze swept the cavern. He pointed a thick finger at the glistening rock wall. And this? Granite holds the cold, man. It'll be like living in an ice house. The damp will get into everything. Your walls will weep with moisture all winter. You'll have mold, sickness. This rock will suck the heat out of that little stove faster than you can feed it. Again, the objection was entirely plausible. Condensation was a constant enemy in frontier cabins. Building directly against a massive cold stone surface seemed like an invitation for disaster. Elias Thorne looked at the rock, then back at Blackwood. His reply was quiet, almost gentle. I'm not trying to warm the mountain, Mr. Blackwood. I'm asking the mountain to warm me. He then added a detail that made no sense to the builder. And the stove won't be breathing our air. He pointed to a small, 4-inch pipe that ran from the base of the stove, under the cabin floor, and out toward the mine entrance. It was a dedicated air intake, drawing oxygen for the fire directly from the outside. Blackwood stared, baffled. The man was sealing his house tight, only to pipe the winter cold directly into his stove. It was backward. It was wrong. He shook his head, a deep sadness in his eyes. He had tried. Don't say you weren't warned, Thorne. He turned and left, his boots crunching on the loose rock. The conversation, reported later at the trading post, sealed Thorne's reputation as a man possessed by a dangerous delusion. The mockery intensified. Thorne's folly, some now called it, an upgrade from Thorne's tomb. The community braced for the inevitable tragedy. By the time the first snows fell in early November, the work was done. From the outside, the only sign of habitation at the Black Mare mine was a simple wooden door set back in the shadows of the entrance, and a thin, lazy wisp of smoke that seemed to rise from the rocks far up the hill. Inside, Elias Thorne had not built a cabin. He had built an engine, a slow, massive, geothermal engine. The system was a closed loop of elegant physics. The dedicated pipe fed cold, dense outside air directly to the stove, meaning the fire never created a draft by sucking warm air from the living space. This alone made the cabin feel remarkably still and quiet. The small stove burned its fuel efficiently, and the hot exhaust gases began their long journey through the metal pipe, snaking through the air gap. This pipe was the heat exchanger. It was a radiator. As the hot gases traveled along its length, they transferred the majority of their thermal energy, waste heat that would have been lost up a traditional chimney, into the contained atmosphere of the 3-foot air gap. The air in this sealed jacket began to warm. This warm air then did its work on the granite walls of the mine chamber. Slowly, relentlessly, it heated the surface of the rock. Granite is dense. It heats slowly, but once heated, it retains that energy for a very long time. It has immense thermal mass. This was the core of Thorne's old-world knowledge. He wasn't fighting the rock. He was charging it with heat, turning the first 40 feet of the mountain into a massive, low-temperature radiator. After a week of running the stove at a moderate temperature, the entire ecosystem of his home stabilized. The air in the gap reached a steady 65 degrees. The surface of the rock walls, now saturated with warmth, radiated that gentle, even heat back towards the cabin. The little timber frame house wasn't struggling against the outside cold. It was floating in a temperate, protected bubble of Thorne's own making, a bubble whose temperature was maintained by the great thermal battery of the mountain itself. The cabin didn't need to be heavily insulated. Its walls were merely a final barrier to keep the radiant heat inside the living space. It was a lung inside a lung. Then December came, and with it, the predator. It started with a sky the color of a dull pewter bowl. The usual winds fell silent, an eerie, unnatural calm that put every animal in the valley on edge. The old-timers looked to the sky and felt a primal dread. This was the sign. The temperature at dawn on December 12th was 15 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. By sunset, the mercury in the trading post thermometer had fallen to 0. That was only the beginning. The next morning, it was 12 below. The wind returned, a shrieking monster from the north that drove the cold into every crack and seam. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, the moisture in one's lungs freezing with every inhalation. The settlers retreated into their cabins, stoked their fires, and began the grim calculus of survival. By the third day, the temperature was 25 below 0 and holding. The barber was relentless, stripping heat from the log walls, finding purchase on every frosted nailhead, and seeping through the floorboards. The cabins, once symbols of security, became prisons of cold. The roaring fires became insatiable beasts, demanding wood around the clock. The sound of axes splitting wood, normally a cheerful winter rhythm, became a frantic, desperate beat against the howl of the wind. Inside the valley's homes, life shrank. Families abandoned outer rooms, huddling together in the single space warmed by the hearth. They draped blankets over doorways to create smaller, more defensible pockets of warmth. The ink froze solid in its wells. A pail of water, left 10 feet from the fire, would be skimmed with ice in under an hour. A rime of frost grew on the blankets of sleeping children, their own breath crystallizing in the frigid air. The suffering was immense. Wood piles that were meant to last until March were half gone in a week. Men risked frostbite to fell more trees in the iron-hard woods, their axe heads threatening to shatter with each blow. Livestock, even in their barns, began to perish. The weak and the old were in mortal danger. This was not a storm. It was a siege. Silas Blackwood, the master builder, suffered with the rest. His cabin, the finest in the valley, with its perfectly squared logs and massive fieldstone fireplace, was failing him. He stuffed his fireplace with seasoned oak, and the flames leaped and roared, but the cold was winning. He could feel it pressing in on him, a tangible weight. His wife coughed in her sleep, a dry, rattling sound that terrified him. He had spent his life mastering the craft of shelter, and his craft was proving to be a fragile thing against the absolute power of the cold. His expertise, his certainty, had become his prison. He felt a deep, gnawing shame, followed by a colder spike of fear, and in his fear he thought of the fool on the hill. He thought of Elias Thorne. A grim, morbid curiosity took hold. He imagined the scene in that rock tomb, the family frozen, huddled around a dead stove, the experiment having met its logical, tragic end. But another thought, a more disturbing one, pricked at his conscience. What if he was wrong? The thought was so alien, so contrary to his entire being, that he almost dismissed it. But the cold in his own home was too profound, his failure too complete. He had to know, he had to see. The journey was an act of will. Pulling on every layer of wool and fur he owned, Blackwood stepped out into the screaming wind and the punishing cold. It was now 35 degrees below 0. The air was a physical blow. He bent his head, pulling his scarf over his face, and began the half-mile trek up the slope to the Black Mare mine. The snow was thigh-deep, its crust sharp and unforgiving. Every breath was a gasp of pain. The world had been bleached of color, reduced to a stark, brutal landscape of white snow, black trees, and the gray, indifferent sky. He felt a growing sense of dread as he climbed. He was a man marching toward a tomb, and he began to feel a terrible guilt. He had warned Thorn, yes, but had he done enough? Should he have forced the man, for his family's sake, to abandon his madness? He reached the mine entrance, a dark slash in the white hillside, and saw almost nothing. There was no smoke from the hidden chimney, no light from within, just silence, save for the howl of the wind. His heart sank. He had been right, and it was the most hollow, sickening victory of his life. He pushed his way through the snowdrift that had piled against the outer door and pounded on the thick planks with a gloved fist. The sound was flat, swallowed by the wind. He waited. Nothing. He pounded again, harder, shouting Thorn's name. He heard a bolt being drawn and the door creaked inward. The first thing that happened was not a sight or a sound, but a feeling. A wave of warmth washed over him, so profound and so unexpected it was like stepping from winter into a summer afternoon. It was a physical force that melted the frost on his beard and pushed back the clawing cold. He stumbled forward, into the mine's entrance, and into the space before the cabin's inner door. Elias Thorn stood there, holding the door open. He was in his shirt sleeves. Blackwood stared, speechless. Thorn simply nodded and gestured him inside the cabin proper. Silas stepped across the threshold, and the world tilted on its axis. The air was warm. Not just tolerable, not just not freezing, but deeply, comfortably warm. It smelled of baking bread and drying herbs. On a large braided rug in the center of the room, Thorn's 2 children were playing with carved wooden animals. They were barefoot. His wife, Annalise, stood at a flour-dusted table, kneading a ball of dough, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. There was no frost on the walls. There was no condensation on the single window pane. Steam rose from a kettle on the small cast-iron stove, which glowed with a gentle, cherry-red heat from a low, lazy fire. It was a scene of impossible, unbelievable domestic normalcy, an island of summer in the heart of a polar nightmare. For a full minute, Silas Blackwood could not speak. He was a builder, a man of wood and stone and iron. His mind raced, trying to reconcile what his senses were telling him with a lifetime of established knowledge. It was not possible. A house could not be this warm when it was 35 below zero outside, not without a forge-sized fire devouring a whole tree every hour. His professional instincts took over. This had to be a trick. He was investigating a mystery. His eyes darted around the room. He looked at the walls, expecting to see them dripping with condensation from the temperature difference. They were bone dry. He walked over to the north wall, the one set deepest into the granite. He pressed his bare palm against the wood. He recoiled, not from cold but from warmth. The wall was warm. Not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm to the touch. It was radiating a gentle, even heat, like a sun-baked stone in late afternoon. It was the most fundamentally wrong thing he had ever felt in his life. He looked at the stove, a small thing, barely big enough to heat a trapper's shack. The fire within was banked low, purring quietly. Then his eyes fell on the wood box next to it. It was almost full. This detail, more than anything else, shattered his understanding of the world. He had burned through more than a cord of wood in his own home in the last 5 days. This small box represented a fraction of that. He turned to Thorn, his voice a hoarse whisper. "How much wood?" he asked. "How much have you burned since the freeze started?" Elias Thorn considered the question, his expression calm and unreadable. "Perhaps a quarter of a cord," he said, his Welsh accent soft in the warm air. A bit more at the start to heat the rock, less now. A quarter of a cord. The number was an insult to Blackwood's reality. It was a physical blow. He had burned 8 times that amount, maybe more, and his family was shivering. Thorne's family was barefoot. He saw a small household thermometer hanging from a nail on the wall, away from the stove. He walked over to it, his boots feeling heavy and clumsy. He leaned in close, his breath fogging for a moment before the warmth cleared it. The mercury stood at 73 degrees. Blackwood stood there, staring at the number, and felt the foundations of his world crumble. Every piece of hard-won experience, every rule of thumb, every certainty he had built his life and reputation upon was a lie. The proof was all around him, in the warm air, the dry walls, the barefoot children, the full wood box, and that impossible number on the thermometer. The numbers were undeniable. The evidence was absolute. He turned slowly to face Elias Thorne. The quiet Welshman was no longer a fool. He was a prophet. Blackwood felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a wave of awe. He had come expecting to find a tomb, and he had found a miracle. "I was wrong," Silas Blackwood said, the words feeling strange and heavy in his mouth. He met Thorne's eyes, holding his gaze. "My God, Thorne, I was completely and utterly wrong. This is impossible." He gestured around the warm, bright room. "You have to teach me. You have to show me how this works." The great freeze lasted for 9 days. When it finally broke, and the temperature clawed its way back toward 0, the valley emerged, blinking, to count the cost. The toll in livestock was heavy. Several outlying cabins had been abandoned, their occupants seeking shelter with neighbors. An elderly trapper who lived alone had been found frozen in his lean-to. The community was shaken, humbled by the power of the winter. But a new story was already spreading, passed in hushed, incredulous tones. It was the story of Thorne's warm cave. Silas Blackwood, a man whose word was as solid as the foundations he built, was its primary author. He described the scene he had witnessed with the zeal of a convert, leaving no detail out. The barefoot children, the shirt sleeves, the warm walls, the full wood box. He was not merely admitting he was wrong. He was proclaiming that Elias Thorne was right on a scale he could barely comprehend. The mockery and suspicion that had surrounded Thorne evaporated, replaced by a deep and urgent curiosity. A procession of men made the pilgrimage up the slope to the Black Mare mine. Thorne, a man who sought no glory, received them all with quiet grace. He opened his door and let the evidence speak for itself. He patiently explained the principles to them, sketching the layout of the air gap and the heat-exchanging stovepipe in the dirt with a stick. He spoke of thermal mass, of radiant heat, and of using the earth not as an enemy, but as an ally. That spring, a revolution in building began in Coulter Valley. Led by a humbled and energized Silas Blackwood, the settlers did not just copy Thorne's design, they adapted it. For new cabins built on open ground, they dug deep foundations, creating cellars lined with thick field stone. They built double walls on the north side of their homes, creating an air gap that could be heated by ducted stovepipes. Blackwood himself designed a new kind of chimney, a thermal flue, made of stacked stone with internal channels that forced hot exhaust gases to travel a longer path, shedding their heat into the stone mass before exiting. The great, inefficient fireplace began to disappear, replaced by smaller, airtight stoves piped into these heat-storing structures. The transformation was not immediate, but it was steady. Each new winter provided more proof. The families living in the Thorne-style homes burned a third of the wood and lived in twice the comfort. The name Thorne's Folly was never spoken again. Instead, people referred to the design with respect, calling it the mountain method or Thorne's principle. Elias Thorne himself never sought a patent or charged $1 for his knowledge. He had solved his problem. His family was safe and warm. That was his only goal. He assisted when asked, offering quiet advice, but mostly he kept to himself, a respected but still enigmatic figure in the community he had inadvertently reshaped. His legacy was not written in books or memorialized in stone. It was written in the comfort of his neighbors, in the dwindling size of their woodpiles, and in the absence of winter funerals. The real impact was not measured in degrees on a thermometer or cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives, in the simple dignity of a family able to use every room in their house during a cold snap. It was measured in the survival of a newborn baby through her first blizzard, sleeping soundly in a warm room, oblivious to the storm that just a few years earlier would have posed a mortal threat. It was measured in the quiet confidence that replaced the gnawing fear of the cold. The story of Elias Thorne is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from celebrated geniuses, but from quiet outsiders who see the world through a different lens. It speaks to the danger of tradition when it becomes dogma, and the arrogance of dismissing an idea simply because it is unfamiliar. Thorne's neighbors thought he was burying his family. In reality, he was tapping into a wisdom as old as the earth itself. His principles, born of necessity in the harsh Montana frontier, echo in modern engineering. The concept of thermal mass is central to passive solar design. His heat-exchanging flue is a direct ancestor of the heat recovery ventilators found in energy-efficient homes today, and his use of the stable temperature of the Earth is the very foundation of geothermal heating and cooling systems. The quiet Welshman was a century ahead of his time. If this story gave you a new appreciation for the forgotten wisdom of the past, hit that like button right now. And subscribe to this channel for more stories of ingenious solutions from history. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to endure? The account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative constructed for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles of thermal mass, geothermal energy, and heat exchange are real and historically applied, the specific characters, names, locations, and events depicted in this story were created to illustrate these concepts in a compelling narrative format. This content is not intended to serve as professional engineering or construction advice.